Hi Aviyah Mechalelas my Darshbe. What does Rabbi Shmuel do with the pasuk Aviyah Mechalelas that the Bas Kohen is Mechalel the father? Maboy Lelechadetanya. They use it for the following limud. Hayra Meir Oimer Matamud Noimar Es Aviyah Mechalel. What does it mean? What is the ramification for the fact that the pasuk says that by committing adultery, the Bas Kohen is Mechalel her father? Shem Hayu Noyagin Bo Kodesh. If they treated the father like a kohen, now they treat him like a chol. Or if they treated him with kavod, noagim babizayon, they treated him in a shameful manner. Why? Oimrim aru shazu yolad. Cursed is the one who gave birth to this woman who was mezaneh. Or shazu gidel. Cursed is the one who raised her. Or sheyatzazu mecholotzav. Cursed is it came out of his loins. Amravashi, Kaman Karina Rishia Bar Rishia, who, when we say someone's a Rasha Bar Rasha or a Rasha Bar Tzedek, it's Kaman Kaitan, is like that Tana, where we sort of punish the father of a Rasha. Zu mitzvahs on his skull. And now, it was strange that the Mishnah ended the description of what you do with skila by zu mitzvahs on his skull. My Tana, the Tana zu mitzvahs on his skull. Because the previous Mishnah, Mishum de Tana, Nigmar Adin, that once there was a verdict, we took him out and killed him.
No appeals, right?
There were no appeals.
Right.
But you could see there was a lot of things that were done to try to get him off in the first place. It was extremely hard. The appeals were initially, it was before the verdict.
Before the verdict.
Once you had a verdict, that was it. Nigmar Adin, well, remember we said that even on the way to the execution, you could wave a flag, and if you come up with some reason to exempt him, they could exempt him. Yeah. But it's not like there was a different court.
The governor, waiting for the governor to call.
Yeah, it was not that there was a different court that could overrule this court. The same court, if they were given evidence that perhaps he was innocent, they would rule on it. Because the Mishnah said, "Beisa skila yagavor shtei koimos." And now we're going to move on to the execution of Sreifa, so we conclude Zu Mitzvah Saniskolim. This concludes how you prepared the skila. Mishnah. Mitzvah Nisrafayim Shakinosov Bezevel Ad Arkavusov. They would sink him into like fertilizer in a way to immobilize him, Rashi says. Shlo yitapech ana va'ana. That means they would put him up to his neck, not to his neck. Adar kuvosov is like, I guess, his waist, his thighs, so that he couldn't move. V'noistim sudar kashel socharake. You took a rough handkerchief within a soft one. V'korech al tzavaro, and you wrap it around his neck. Like a long kerchief, one is holding on to one end of it, and the other is holding on to the end of it, and you wrapped it around his neck here. So what is this? The purpose of this was each side would pull, it would force the person to open up his mouth. They had a piece of lead that was molten. They put it into his mouth. It would go down into his intestines. The chomeres is it would burn him on the inside. Rabbi Omer, afhu imes biyadam. Now, if these two people pulled too hard, they would choke him. And that's a problem. Then if that happened, lo yumakami bo mitzvah sreifa. So, in fact, Rabbi Yehuda rejects this methodology. And he says this is going to lead to people getting choked before they get killed with sreifa. Ela poseches piv b'tzvas shelo b'tovaso. They put like a dental retractor that Harold would use when he was a dentist. They put something in his mouth to keep his mouth open. And it says shelo b'tovaso means it was against his will. It was painful. And they did it forcibly. And that keeping that opened his mouth. Umadlikas apsila v'zorkol sochpiv. And then they fired up this piece of lead and threw it into his mouth. And it burns the inside. There was a bas Kohen who committed adultery. And in this community, like Joan of Arc, they gathered branches around her, sarfu, and they burnt her. Like being burnt at the stake, right? Was, they just tie you to a stake and they gathered firewood and they burnt you. But that's not the Jewish way of Sreifa. The Bezdin in that community made a mistake. They didn't know they would stook him.
Did any of this ever happen? I mean, it seems like from the Mishnah that it really happened.
Yes. What do you ask?
I'm saying
we know executions did take place.
so but I mean, this thing obviously happened because the Mishnah says
it happened. Yeah, but Rashi says they would stook him. They didn't learn the Gzeira Shava that we're going to learn, which teaches that the burning is not supposed to be an external burning, it's supposed to be an internal burning. So we know Tzedukim don't learn the principles of Torah Shabbat Peh. So they learned the way the Torah wrote, the Saraftim Ba'esh, that you burn them with fire. So they understood that it meant burning the person mamish. Okay. So the Gemara says, my psila. What is this wick? Amrav Mas. The psila shalaver means a piece of lead. Now, minolan. Now, where do we see that this type of death is called sreifa? Asher sreifa me adas korach. Now, in the rebellion of Korach, when the people, the 250, who were makriv a foreign age, not everybody was swallowed up by the ground. There were those that were killed with sreifa. There also, malal and sreifas neshama v'guf kayim, there was an internal burning. It was just an inside burning. So afkan sreifas neshama v'guf kayim. So we learn Gzeira Shava from Adas Korach that it's not an external burning, it's an internal burning. Rabbi Lazar Amar Asya sreifas mibnei Aaron, a different limun. The Nadav Avihu were also killed by an internal sreifa. Malal and sreifas neshama v'guf kayim, their body remained. Afkan sreifas neshama v'guf kayim. Now, why does one Tana learn from Adas Korach and the other from Nadav Avihu? Mandi Aleph Madas Korach, the one that learns from Adas Korach Menole, deceive v'asmachtos hachatoim ha'ele benafshoisam. These people brought sticks with the incense, and they brought it with their nefesh, and ishmas and nisrefes for guf kayim. That's a remez that they were killed where the neshama was burnt with the body remaining. The idich. So what does the other mandomer do with this pasuk? Hayisreif mamishi. They hold that by the Adas Korach they were mamish burnt. That they did through their own will, because Korach convinced them, he led them to be judged through the punishment of Sreifa. Kid Reish Lakish. Dar Reish Lakish might receive, it says in Pasuk in Tehillim, Bechanfe lage ma'og chorek alai shinemo. Bishil chanufa shechenifu lekorach aliske legima. The Korach sort of convinced these people through eating and drinking. He gave them to eat, he gave them to drink, he brought them over to his side. Chorak alein sar shel Gehenim shinov. So the master of Gehenim showed his teeth. And they fell into Gehenim because of their sins. Okay. Now, Uman diyolov mibnei Aaron minole. How do they learn from Bnei Aaron? It says they died in front of Hashem. It says Vateitze eish mifnei Hashem v'tochalo sa vayamusu v'nei Hashem. It's like a regular death. when a person dies, his body is still intact, it just dies. So they're learning that the Vayamusu means they died and their body remained intact. Now, the other mandomer who learns from Adas Korach, what does he do with this limud? He says, Ahu Srei for Mamishav. That by Nodav Aviv they were mamish burnt. And Umaydich Sivayamusu, the Aschil Behu Migavai Kein Misa, that yes, the burning started from the inside like a regular death, and then it continued to the outside. Abba Yossi ben Dustoy Oimer. Shnei Chutin Shalesh Yotzim Beis Kodesh Kadoshim. There were two streams of fire that came out of Kodesh Kadoshim. V'nechla Kula Arba. And they broke up into four. Two went into the two nostrils of Nadav, and two of the streams went into the nostrils of Avihu and burnt them. He burnt them, which seems to imply there's a little bit of a miyut. Now, according to the one that says that they were all burned, where's the miyut? Osam v'lo bigdeim. The miyut, according to that mandam, would be them, but not their clothing. It means, even according to the Shita, that they were completely burned, not an internal burning, but an external burning. The nace was that the begodim didn't burn. Now, the Gemara wants to know, right now, the Gemara had two Manda Omrim. One learned from Adas Korach, the other learned from Nodav Aviv. Now, why not learn it v'neilif miporman nisrafim? We have korbanos. For example, the par helem dover shel tzibur. If the Sanhedrin paskined on a piece of meat that they said was kosher, and it turns out that it was chaylev, which is if people eat it, you get kores. But they did it obviously because an incorrect psak of the bestin. And if greater than 50%, so if less than 50% of Klal Yisrael eat this meat, so then each individual person ate it b'shogeg, and they have to bring a personal korban chatas. Like any time you violate an aveira, where the punishment is kores, and you do it b'shogeg, you bring a korban chatas. However, the halacha is that if 51% of Klal Yisrael committed an aveira because of an erroneous psak of Bezdin, then Bezdin itself would bring a korban. It was par helem dover shel tzibur, and this is an example of one of the parim anisrafim, where the par would be completely burned. Now, the par on Yom Kippur, because remember there was a par and a sa'ir. The Kohen Gadol would offer a par and a goat, right? They were chosen. They did a lottery. One gozel, one was offered as a korban. So there was a sa'ir hanisrafim and there was parim hanisrafim. So the Gemara wants to know mala halon b'sreifel mamish afkan sreifel mamish. Now there's no internal burning. The par was burned completely. So maybe we should learn that by the sreifa of a bas kohen, it should also be a mamish sreifa. So the Gemara says mistaver me'adam avlei lemelech. No, Adas Korach and Nadav Avihu were human beings. So we would rather learn a halacha that relates to a human being from another human being. Shekain, and these are the things that relate to human beings. Number one, Adam. It's a human being. Chote, right? It's somebody who sins. Both by Adas Korach and by Nadav Avihu, they sinned. Neshama, that the person died through that sreifa. There is no pigul. Pigul is when you offer a korban with an improper machshava. Well, both by Adas Korach And by the death of Nadav Avihu, there's no pigul involved. And a Parman Israfim is not an Adam, it's not a Chote, there's no Neshama, and there's no pigul. So those are the logical reasons why we would prefer to learn the Gzeir Shava from either Adas Korach or Nadav Avihu, and not from the Parman Israfim. The Gemara says, Adarabba, Pum Fakir, just the opposite. Mi Parman Israfim Avli Lemelav. We should learn from Parman Israfim. Shekain. So we have Machshir. So what the Bnei Korach did, and what Nadav Avihu did, they were Averas. They were not mitzvahs. Now, by the Bas Kohen, you're doing a streifa. The streifa's bezdin is a hechsher, right? We've learned it's a kapora. And Parman Yisrafim also leads to a kapora. So that's a reason, perhaps, to learn the Gzeira Shava from Parman Yisrafim. That's number one. And L'doiros. Now, this halacha of killing a Bas Kohen with streifa is halacha for future generations. It's not just for that generation. But the killing of Nadav Avihu and the killing of Adas Karch were just events that happened during the 40 years in the Midbar. It's not for generations. The Parman Yisrafim are also a halacha that applied for future doiros. So here are two logical aspects that would have told us that we should learn the Gzeir Shava from Parman Yisrafim. Answers the Gemara, Hanech Nefishin. Yeah. But the other four, which we learned from Adam, which was Adam, Chota, Neshama, Pigul, are more. It's 4 versus 2. That's why we learn from Adas Korach and Nadav Avihu. Now we ask, Man Yelif me Adas Korach, my time Elod Yolif Ne'ara. The one who's learning from Adas Korach, why didn't he learn from Ne'ara? Because they held that Ahusrei from Mamishavi. They hold that Nadav Avihu were mamish burned completely. So v'neilef minei. So why not learn that by the Bas Kohen she should be burned externally? So burning somebody from the outside is a more cruel punishment than this swallowing the molten lead. That seems to be quicker, and the person will die quicker than the being burnt at the stake. Now, v'chime'achar de'ika de Rav Nachman. So if we have this principle of Rav Nachman, which is ahavta l'recha kamocha, choose a good mitzvah, then what do you need the Gzeir Shava Lamali? Even without the Gzeir Shava, if you have two ways of burning, an internal burning and an external burning, and we know that the internal burning is easier for the person, then we know we don't need the Gzeir Shava. So the Gemara says, Ilav Gzeir Shava, we need the Gzeir Shava, because if we wouldn't have the Gzeir Shava, Hava Mina, Sreifa Neshama V'Guf Kayim Lav Sreifa Yiklal. We might have thought that an internal burning doesn't equal Sreifa. It doesn't fall into the getter of Sreifa, so we have to be told yes. And if we only had V'Havlecha Kamocha, Lofish Lechavilas Mors, Kechet Lisraf Lagel. If you're going to just use V'Havlecha Kamocha, then just use a lot of firewood so that the guy would burn quickly. So we have to be taught that Enochanami, the internal Sreifa is Sreifa, and that's how we do it. And then, because we mentioned Nadav Avihu, the Gemara here gives us a story. Moshe and Aaron are walking in front of Klal Yisrael. The Nadav Avihu malchin achreya. Now, Nadav Avihu were big people. They were like the heirs apparent. because they walked directly behind Moshe v'Aaron. Achreim v'chol Yisrael achreim, and behind them walked all of Yisrael. So right away, the Gemara is setting this up that none of Avihu were really big people. Omer lo Nadav lavihu. Nadav said to Avihu, he said, one of these two old geezers gonna die, and we're gonna take over. So Amalana Kodesh Baruch Hu, Hanira mi koivres mi. Let's see who buries who. And that's what happened. Amrav Papa Hainu Damri Inchi Nefishi Gamli Savitatini Mashchid Ugni. That there are a lot of old camels that are carrying very heavy weight, even more than the younger camels. That's the saying that, you know what, it's not always that the younger are better. Amr Rabbi Eliezer. How does the Talmid Chacham appear to Nam Haaretz? He's like a golden cup. See Periamenu, he drinks from it a little bit. Then it becomes like a silver cup. Menu, but if he has hanoah from it, then he even lessens its value. It's like clay. Once it breaks, you can't repair it. A very expensive kalim can be repaired. Imrasa bas Toli bas Kohen shezin sahavi. There was a woman, Imrasa bas Toli. She was a bas Kohen. She committed adultery. After Rav Chama bar Tuvia chavila is moiris v'sarfa. So Rav Chama gathered firewood and burnt her. Amar Rav Yosef ta betarti. He made two mistakes. Ta b'alacha. Because Rav Mas already told us that Sreifa is supposed to be done with internal burning. V'ta b'detanya. He also made a mistake. It says, Uvasa la kohanim alvim ela shofet asher yeh b'yamim ahem. So it's bisman sheyesh kohen. It's when there's a base of mikdash, yesh mishpat. Then you have execution. Remember, Rav Chama is an Amoira, lived in Bavel. So what's going on here? There's no base of mikdash. Bisman she'ein kohen ein mishpat. So there were two mistakes made. Our Mishnah also said the same thing in the Mishnah, that there was a bas kohen who was burned. The Chachamim said it's not correct. On Rav Yosef, Beizin shel tzdukim havi. It just says sreifa, and they learned sreifa without Torah Shabbat Peh. So the Gemara questions whether this indeed was the dialogue between the Chachamim and the Tzdukim. Vatanya, there's a different version. Am Rav Zab Rav Tzadok. Zucharani kishayiti tinek. He remembers when he was an infant. Umurkav al ktefa shalaba, and my father was carrying me on his shoulders. Ve'viu bas kohen shezin, so v'kifu chavilis mors v'sarfu. And they brought firewood and they burnt her at the stake. Amru lo. So the Chachamim said to Rabbi Elazar, Kot na'isa. Number one, we don't accept your testimony because you were a kot. Vein levin raimin kot. We don't bring any proof because you probably didn't understand what was going on completely at that time. That seems to be a little different gears than what we learned. Says the Gemara Shnei Maisim Havu. There were two different stories. And each one, Rabbi Elazar Rav Tzadok gave testimony. And the Gemara wants to know, hey, Amar Lahu Berei, which one did he say first? Which story did he say first? What is written in our Mishnah? That a Bezdin of Tzdukim, and it was not something that he was a cotton. That doesn't make sense. Because if he had said, This was something that he testified to when he was an adult, and they still didn't believe him, and they pushed him out by saying that this was not an appropriate bezdin. So so what? The next story is going to be that he was a cotton. Certainly, that must make sense more. That this first story that was told was when it was about a cotton, and later on about a cotton. Elohar Bereisha was the Tosefta, and V'armelo cotton ayisa. So they rejected it by saying there's no proof because you were a cotton. Then he told the other story. V'amar kishu gadol v'armelo and they shlaya based in shlaya shabaki. They would stukim. That's what the dialogue goes. Okay. So far, we have covered skila, and we've covered sreifa. The next is hereg, being beheaded. Mitzvahs on erogim ayu matism es rosh b'sayim. They would cut somebody's head off with a sword. Kederach shamal chusoysa. That's how the government did it. But Rabbi Yehuda Omer nivel hulo. That's a very ugly way of being killed. Elamanichis es rosho ala sadin. You laid him down on a table, like a blacksmith table. The koitzitz bekupitz, and then you use the special type of knife to cut his head off. Amr lo misa menovelos misa. That's the worst misa. Better that they were killed by just the way the kings did it, by cutting off your head. Tanya. I know that this is a bad misa. We have another lav. Don't do what the goyim do. So if the goyim cut off people's heads with the sword, we shouldn't do it because of uvechukosem lo selech. So how do the Rabbanon answer? Rabbanon kiven dichsiv saif boraisa. The Torah talks about being killed with a sword. So lo minayu kagaminan. It's got a source from the Torah. We're not learning it from them. If you remember when we learned in Yoreh Day at Sorbim Rabbanon, we learned the sugi of Bechukos HaGoyim, and we brought some of these material too, that if there's a source in the Torah that precedes what we learned from the Goyim, you're allowed to do it. Okay. Because if you don't say it like this, we have another case. Haditanya, Sorfin ala Malachim. There was a practice that when a Jewish king would die, people would burn their clothing as a sign of avelis. And it's not considered darkei amori, permitted. So the Gemara says, Heich sarfinan, but it's a practice of the Goyim. But kiven diksuv sreifa doraisa, but it says sreifa, because in Yirmiyahu it says, that the Jewish kings would do the same thing, then lav minayu kagamina. Then we're not learning it from the Goyim. Since the Torah itself writes about using the sword to kill, lav minayu kagamina. When the fact that we do it, we're not learning it from them because it has a source in our Torah. Bidich Pirkin says later on, it says Elu Heina Ne'erogim. The following crimes get killed through herek, which is through the sword. 2 criminals, Rotseach, right, a murderer, V'anshe Irani Dachas. So Binshme Irani Dachas Ksiv Buhu. By Irani Dachas says Haket Hakes Yoshvei Ha'irahi. Lefi Chorev, you shall strike them with a sword. So, Ela Rotzech Minola. Where do you see that a Rotzech is killed with the sword? The Tanya. It says, V'chiyake ish esavdo, if you strike your Eved Oes Amaso Bashevet, Umeis Tachas Yado, Nakom Yinakem. revenge will be taken out on you. Nekima zu enyodemahu. The Gemara says, I don't know what nekama means. Kishu omer. It says in the Tochacha in Parshas Bechukosai, Ve'vesi alachem cherev nikmas nekam bris. So we see nekama is connected to cherev. Avi omer nekima zu sayif. So that's how we learn that a rotzeach is killed with sayif. Well, how do you know that you have to cut his head off? The aim at the borzle mivris. Maybe you just stick him with a sword in his heart. So he says, Lafi cherev ksiv. So you don't do it with the sharp point. You do it with the whole part of the blade. I've aimed David like gister. Maybe you cut him in half in the middle of his body. Then we use the principle that we've used before, that if you cut him in the middle of the body, that's more pain. It's not a nice death. It's an easier death to be had your head cut off. But that's Ashkechan de Katel Avda. The source for this was if you struck your Eved, that you're killed beside. Maybe Barchorim in Olan. Maybe if you kill a free man, you have a worse punishment. V'lav kal v'chomer hu, or the Gemara says it's a kal v'chomer. Katel Avda b'sayif. So Barchorim would only get bechenek. So clearly it's going to get the same at least. So hanich lemandomer chenek kal. That's only good. You have a limud if you say chenek is worse, is easier. Lemandomer chenek chomer, but according to the mandomer, the chenek is worse. Maybe Michael Maimer. Maybe killing an eved would get sayif, but killing a free person, you'd get the worst punishment, which would be chenek. So we learn out how do we know that rotzech for anybody you get hereg nafkalei from a different brisa, from Egla Rufa. It says, there's a din that if you find a dead body close to two cities and you don't know, so there's a whole process that you have to bring a calf down to the river and you have to chop its head off from behind, and it's a kapora because we didn't do lavoy, we didn't escort that person. It says vatat tever adam hakim mikbecha hukshu kol shavchei damim legla rufa. All murderers are compared to egla rufa. Mala halon b'sayev umenat saver. There it's with a sword and from the neck. Avkan b'sayev umenat saver. So by rotzeach it's also with a sword and from the neck. Freitimori mala halon bekupitz. There was a special like a hat, like an axe by negla rufa. Umimul ha'oiref. From the back of the neck, afkan bekupitz umul oiref. So we don't use an axe, we use a sword for a rotzeach. Then mitzvah nichnokim. Adultery was the primary crime that you would get chenek, choking. How did you do that? They would also sink him into fertilizer so he couldn't move. They would put a rough handkerchief within a smooth handkerchief, and this would be tied around his neck. So they would strangle him. Each side would pull on each side until he died. Torah it says, Ish asher yinafis eishes ish, a man who lives with a married woman, asher yinafis eishes reu, mos yumas, hanoef hanoafes, should be killed the adulterer and the adulteress. Ish, prat lekotten. So you don't kill a cotton. If he's under bar mitzvah, he's not killed. We'll see, even though a 9-year-old can already have bia, according to the Gemara, but he wouldn't be killed because he's not an ish. Asher yinafis eishes ish, prat leishes cotton. So if a woman is married to a katan, it's not a real nisuin. And therefore, if you have relations with the wife of a katan, you wouldn't be killed. Eishes re'eh, you probably eishes acherim. So if you live with a married woman who's married to a goy, then you're not killed. It's only if she's married to a Jew. Mos yumas means bechenek. Now, we don't know how the Gemara derived that, but that's what the Baraisa says. Then ata oimer bechenek oinel bachas michol misas hamus. Maybe it's other misa. Where'd you come up with chenek? Amrit. Komakom shenemar misa stam einata rishai l'mosh chalachmar le'alakil aleh. Div Rabbi Yoshia. If it just says misa plain, we have no right to make it worse for him. And they're learning that chenek is the easiest way of misa. That's the way Rav Yoshia learned. Rav Yonis Amar lo mipnei shehi kala. It's not because it's the easiest. Ela kol misa amor b'torah stam ein ela chenek. It's exeres hakasuv. Misa, when the Torah refers to it, refers to chenek. The other misos had to be explained. Sreifa, skila, right? Chereg, the Torah writes about them. Then there's this third shita, Rabbi Oimer, which is a little bit like Rav Yonason. Nemer misa b'dei shamayim, v'nemer misa b'dei adam. It talks about, if you eat truma, you die, but that's not death through the Beis Din. Hashem causes your death. And then we have times where Beis Din puts people to death. Ma misa mor b'dei shamayim, misa she'en b'roishem. Usually, misa b'dei shamayim, there's no external evidence that you were killed. You just died. So misa mor b'dei adam, misa she'en b'roshem. Chenek, I guess, is the misa that there's the least effect on the body. That when you look at it, you look at somebody's skila, he's fallen off a cliff and stoned. Sreifa, I guess, there's evidence of burning at least in his mouth area. When you have his head cut off, of course, there's a roshem. But being choked, there's the least roshem. So, however, the Gemara asks like the ema streifa, which we don't see an external roshem. So, mida omer achmana bas kohen b'streifa means mechlad havla bas streifahi. Well, we know that other forms of znus is not going to be streifa, and which doesn't make a roshem, which is clearly chenek. Okay, so that's where we are so far.
Very gory details.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to learn the